Welcome back to Comedian MTG. My name is Ian. So I am back from vacation. I had a lovely time down in Florida, and while I was there, Lou and I happened to pop into SCG Tampa for their cEDH 5K. And as you can see by this lovely picture here, I made the top four. Let's see if I can unblock it with my body. There we go. I made the top four of this cEDH tournament. So it's been a decent amount of time since I've actually returned, and this tournament was actually over a week ago at this point. But timelines get a little messed up when you go on vacation. We're gonna take some time to talk about my deck from the tournament. I brought a pretty cool Silas Dargo brew, and we're also gonna take time to talk about my rounds from the tournament. Now, as I mentioned, it's been a little bit of time since the tournament itself, so it's gonna be a little foggy. I'm not going to have as many details as I might have from some other tournaments. That'll be a little bit more in recent memory, but still, it was a really awesome time. I had fun bringing a pretty cool deck, and yeah, cool stuff from there. Before we go into our deck, I want to thank our sponsors for today, Video, Heavy Play, and Tales of Adventure Magic. We're also going to be seeing the decks from Moxfield today. Moxfield is an awesome deck building site. We'll be talking about those as well. So I played a list this weekend called Dark Dargo, and this is a Silas Dargo build. So the week before this tournament, I was like, hey, this is one of my first tournaments after the Top Deck Invitational. And I was like, well, I kind of am in that place now where I can go back to just playing cool brews and fun decks and spicy stuff. And I'm like, what do I want to do for this tournament? And I was looking through some of the new cards from some of the new sets. I wasn't really feeling super inspired. And one of the cards that is from the newer sets that has me feeling super inspired right now is actually Valley Flood Color. And I was like, I really want to play a Valley Flood Color deck, but obviously I don't want to just play something as simple as like Kinnan or Rogsai again, right? I want to do something fun and unique and kind of doing its own thing, right? So I landed on Silas Dargo after polling some of my Patreons over at patreon.com/comedianmtg. If you're interested in being in conversations like that, where sometimes I do come to my patrons and I'm like, hey guys, help me pick out a deck for the weekend. And one of our patrons, Ben Aki Herman, who's actually someone I worked on a Silas Dargo brew that looks a little bit different than this finished product. We had talked about this deck a decent amount, and then this kind of re-inspired me to work on it, especially given that it kind of fit all of the criteria that I was hoping to have in a deck for this event. So what does Silas Dargo provide, right? So obviously the Grixis shell is really, really powerful right now, right? A lot of Grixis decks are very strong, especially, everything really got a big upgrade with the print of Necro Dominance in also, basically having a secondary copy of Necropotence in your decks a lot of the times. That in combination with now that we have the Valley Flood Caller on top of the already very, very present Born Upon a Wind, those lines got a lot more powerful over the course of the past few months. So those lines are very strong. Ad nauseum style strategy is very strong right now, that Grixis core that I just mentioned. So figured, hey, let's mess around with a lot of that stuff, but also give our own Dargo spin to it. Now, one of the cards I was originally messing around that you will actually see in the sideboard here is Kozilek's Unsealing. And through a little bit of brewing, I realized that the way the deck was shaping out to be, this card would not really work with what the final product was. But Kozilek's Unsealing is another really cool reason to be messing around with Dargo in blue. And despite it being one of the more original inspirations for the deck, I still think it's really good just in a different version of this deck. I was actually talking about this deck this weekend with someone completely different. And I said, there's an entirely different version of this deck that focuses more on Phyrexian Altar and Kozilek's Unsealing and stuff like that. But that's not what this version is doing. So 25 land, pretty low land count. As we mentioned, there's definitely those turbo ad nauseum style aspects to the deck. You have things like Bolas' Citadel, but also and ad nauseum and breach lines, right? So you can win through Underworld Breach, Brain Freeze, and Lion's Eye Diamond, as well as Underworld Breach and grinding station lines that are also in the deck. But what's really cool about this version is that Dargo also gives you the ability to use Altar of Dementia to be an Underworld Breach combo, because you can sacrifice Dargo to mill yourself for 7. And if you have a single red mana, as long as you've done an appropriate amount of sacrifices to get to that point, your Altar of Dementia basically turns into like 1 red, recast Dargo, sack it to mill yourself 7, which obviously works pretty well with an Underworld Breach. And so some of the stuff that you're going to see in a deck like this one, it's more Dargo specific synergies. You're going to see little creatures like these, like Impulsive Pilfer, things that when they die, very early one drops, you get something out of them, right? The two big ones are Stitcher Supplier and Impulsive Pilfer for this deck. Stitcher Supplier actually is also another Underworld Breach line. So with Stitcher Supplier and very classic Turbo Nas staple Culling Week, you actually just open up a complete other line with Underworld Breach, because you're able to mill 6 by playing and sacrificing the Stitcher Supplier to Culling Week, and the line basically costs 6 cards out of your yard, but nets you 2 black mana and also allows you to sculpt 6 cards out of your graveyard, much like grinding station lines do in Breach. So it's pretty cool that there's this kind of inherent sacrifice synergy that also just opens up an entirely new Nas line for the deck, which is pretty sweet. It actually did come up during one of my games. One of the combos that you get in the deck is either with Bergie. So Bergie kind of doing double duty as like the normal turbo sort of outlet, whether it's giving you more mana or using the Harnfell side to get you card advantage when you're low on that. But if you have it on the Bergie side, this also can be replaced by Relic of Legends, which allows you to tap an untap legend to add a 1 mana of any color. If you get enough so that Dargo costs 1 mana out of the command zone, and then you have one of those two pieces, either Relic of Legends or Bergie, and Altar of Dementia, what basically happens is you are able to create a loop where you play Dargo, mill, pay again for a single mana, do it again, right? Like we mentioned with the Breach line, except for this is actually able to mill out your opponents, right? So if you have Relic of Legends, for example, and Dargo only costs 1, you play Dargo, you use the Relic ability, which means you can get around Summoning Sickness, to tap Dargo for red, sack it to the altar, which means another sacrifice has happened that turn, play Dargo again, and eventually you're able to loop. Let's look at Dargo just in case anyone's not really familiar. Dargo is just a 7/5 trampler that says that as an additional cost to cast this spell, you may sacrifice any number of artifacts and or creatures. This spell costs 2 less to cast for each permanent sacrifice this way, and 2 less to cast for each other artifact or creature you've sacrificed this turn. So with the loops we've mentioned, as long as you have that initial cost of Dargo down to a single red mana, you're able to keep casting Dargo out of the zone for this turn, right? So it is important to mention, and this did happen to me at one point, where if you get super blown out on some of these Dargo combos, Dargo then ends up costing like 15 or 16, like just something ridiculous, 15, 17, 20 something, like out of the command zone, right? Obviously it's not going to cost 16 because that's an even number, but point being, you kind of need to go a little bit all in with the Dargo combos, and if they fizzle, unfortunately you have to find a different way to win the game. We also have Silas here. Now, this is actually a bit better of a Silas deck than Rogsai, specifically because the interaction with Jeweled Lotus is really nice, right? You're able to go like land Jeweled Lotus, crack it right away to play Silas, and then next turn attack with Silas. And obviously Jeweled Lotus has a really nice relationship with Dargo because it basically pays for 5 mana out of Dargo because it's an artifact being sacked that makes 3 commander mana. So basically, if you do nothing else in those first 2 turns, you can literally, with Jeweled Lotus alone, go land, Jeweled Lotus, play Silas, attack with Silas, bring back the Jeweled Lotus next turn, play your land drop, play Jeweled Lotus, crack at Dargo, right? And that's like the worst case scenario for the bare minimum what you can do. So they have a really healthy relationship with one another, which is pretty nice. Silas also allows you to play an early Vexing Bauble, which I really liked, and then start using it for value as the game went on, right? So I was able to like play Vexing Bauble to shut off my opponent's free spells, which once again did come up in certain games over the course of the tournament. And then, as I'm going to combat, hit somebody with Silas, crack the bauble in response to the Silas trigger, or crack in response to Silas doing damage before the trigger would be put in the stack, right? You'd get to draw a card, and then you can just play the bauble back out of the graveyard for a single mana, right? So you're able to like continuously loop that kind of for card advantage, which is pretty nice. And then talking about some of the other Dargo synergies, we have Altar of the Wretched here. And this is one of the reasons that like 1, Silas in the zone is pretty nice. And then 2, you're able to like a lot of these artifact and things like Goblin Engineer and stuff like that, right? Goblin Engineer is a card I'm historically a little bit low on, but specifically because you get access to Altar of the Wretched, it's pretty nice in this deck. Altar of the Wretched enters the battlefield. You may sack a non-token creature, most likely your Dargo. and you draw X and mill X, where X is that creature's power, right? So this 3 mana card is now able to basically draw you a full grip of 7 if you have Dargo on the field, right? And that's obviously a very powerful synergy. I will mention that Dargo is the best defense grid commander, right? Because in general, if things are going wrong and you're like trying to win with your deck, and then you realize, oh no, defense grid, maybe something goes wrong and you realize I can't win anymore, you can still always pay that red mana to get your Dargo out, sacrifice the defense grid. I actually had one of the games where I realized Dockside was going to be fed for a lot, and I had too many artifacts in general, right? And I was like, okay, these artifacts are actually hurting me more than they're helping me. So I just like sacrificed my own Dargo, recast out of the zone, sacked a bunch of rocks that I didn't need, and then they weren't able to win with that Dockside, which is pretty nice. So you may see Chthonian Nightmare in this deck and be a little bit confused because there's no outlet for Dockside and Chthonian Nightmare. For those who don't know, Chthonian Nightmare and Dockside, as long as your opponents have your Dockside able to make 5 treasures, and you have another creature apart from Dockside in the graveyard with a mana value of 3 or less, you can make infinite mana by looping Chthonian Nightmare and Dockside and the other creature over and over and over again, right? But once again, with Silas and Dargo, we do not have an outlet in the command zone for any of these things. However, with sort of the composition of this deck, there are actually a lot of cards that do actually act as an outlet, right? We have things like Fairy Mastermind, where you can basically force everyone to draw their entire decks, and you have a decent amount of answers. This is the last case scenario one, to be clear. You can loop Goblin Engineer to put all your artifacts in your graveyard and eventually be able to like hit with Silas, get those back. You can loop Orcish Bowmasters, ping your opponents with those. You can mill your entire library with Stitcher Supplier, and then when your library is milled, you can get back a Thassa's Oracle. That one's pretty funny. With Grinding Station, as you're going through the loop, when eventually you are making near unlimited mana, you can start milling your opponents out with the Grinding Station. After you have unlimited treasures, you can start playing Dargo and sacking it to alter Dementia over and over again, right? So there's a healthy amount of outlets in this deck. Brain Freeze is even an outlet, right? Because you're just casting stuff over and over and over and over again. Eventually your storm is like 40 billion. You just mill your opponents out. So there's actually a lot of different ways that you can win with Chthonian Nightmare loops, even if it's not, the original intent being, oh, hey, this is actually how you just take out your opponents, right? So that part's pretty cool. There's a bunch of different really cool, cute synergies you can do with stuff like that too. So I had a ton of fun playing this deck. As I mentioned, like some of the play patterns of the list can just turn into those traditional, like, oh, I'm playing a fast Grixis deck. Like you jam your Nas, you jam your early Bolas's Citadel, you jam your Wheels, all that kind of stuff, right? But then other times you're doing really cool stuff where you're getting like a Dargo out early, and then you're casting a Burnt Offering, which makes you like 7 mana, and then you're using that to Beseech the Mirror into your win con, and that part's all really cool too. So the deck had a lot of flexibility, a lot of fun. I like that, I could still scratch that itch of having like some creature combos in my deck, mostly with your commander, while also, being able to play these fast, sort of more explosive strategies, and getting to mess around with, as I mentioned, our good friend Valley Floodcaller, who is quite good in this deck. Big shout out to sponsor of the episode, Tales of Adventure Magic. Tales of Adventure is an awesome online card retailer, and you can actually pick up cards you order online at location. So for example, at the event I just went to, Star City Games, there was a Toa Magic booth. So if I'd ordered cards online, I could pick them up at the Toa Magic booth. Check out toamagic.com, use code comedian at checkout for a discount on your order. So round 1 of this tournament, and as I mentioned, it's been a little bit of time since this event, so I'm going to be a little rusty on some of the details. So first round, I went first against an Amanatu brew, which is pretty cool. A Tavesh and Dargo, I want to say list. Or is it Tavesh Jeska? It was some Rakdos Tavesh deck. And in last seat was Sisei. In that game, we had sort of just been developing a few advantage engines. I was able to play a Mockingbird on turn 2, copying one of my opponent's Ignoble Hierarchs, while also playing a Talisman on that turn. And then on turn 3 on the play, I just jammed a Bolas's Citadel, and my opponents did not have an answer to my Bolas's Citadel. So about 15 spells later, I assembled an Underworld Breachline with Grinding Station and was able to win the game pretty succinctly after that. So round 1, a little bit of a quicker round, but yeah, just sort of played a really sweet Bolas's Citadel and was able to take the win. Want to thank our episode sponsor, Heavy Play. Heavy Play is a partner of the channel currently, and it's been really awesome working with Heavy Play. They make an awesome deck box product, an awesome line of products. When I was at SCG Tampa, I went to the Heavy Play booth and I even bought another deck box for myself because I've been enjoying using the Heavy Play products so much. They are a sweet product. There are deck boxes, there are dice trays, there are mats, there are sleeves. It's a super sleek line of product using magnets to probably their most optimal potential, keeping your product safe. Super happy with my Heavy Play products, as I mentioned, so much so that I went and bought a personal box for myself. Really cool stuff. They actually have new sideboard guides and life total pads for more 60 card style Magic. So if that's something of interest to you, you can check that out at heavyplay.com. On your first order, whether it's deck box, playmats, life guides, all that kind of stuff, you can use code comedian to get a percentage off your order. Thank you to Heavy Play for sponsoring this episode. So round 2, I'm playing against Rogsai in first seat, then me in second seat. In third seat, we have a Dargo Timna list. And funny enough, Sean, who is our Rogsai player, is actually known by Manila online. Also is very classically a Dargo Thrasios player, but he was playing Rogsai that weekend. So we were definitely teasing him a bunch because there were 2 people in the pod on Dargo and he was not on it. And then I can't remember for the life of me what our 4th player was playing during that game. As I mentioned, it's been a little bit of time since that game. But very quickly on turn 2, I was able to get out Underworld Breach with Stitcher Supplier and Culling the Week. But Rogsai ahead of me had played Aristic Study. Now, luckily, the combo that I just mentioned is one where you can actually use the extra mana you make to pay for Aristic Study at one point. And so I'm sculpting my graveyard, going through, milling a bunch. And this was a punt because I got in my own head. I had sort of forgotten that you can just mill down till you hit brain freeze, right? I was very nervous about trying to go off through this Ristic Study, right? So at one point, I instead of going down and just milling for that brain freeze, and at that point, once again, doesn't matter. Like basically, the only thing that stops me at that point is a Mind Break Trap versus. And which obviously he had not drawn at that point because I was paying for Ristic Study the whole time as I'm going through this loop, right? So basically, as long as Brain Freeze isn't in my like bottom 15 to 20 cards of my deck, I should be able to win the game at that point, right? Unfortunately, I think just because of exhaustion, I had gone down and milled, and I didn't think of the Brain Freeze line. But what I did see was that I had the ability to cast a Mana Crypt and then a Bolas' Citadel out of my graveyard. And I figured with an active Underworld Breach, with the Bolas' Citadel, I should be able to assemble something in a way where I can break out of this sort of lock that the Ristic Study has me under. Unfortunately, so I played the Bolas' Citadel out of my graveyard and proceeded to immediately hit a land in my 25 land deck off the top of my library. So that completely fizzled me. At that point, Rogsai had drawn a couple cards at that point and was able to, the other decks didn't really draw anything to be able to stop him. My Bolas' Citadel had a land on top, not any counter magic or anything like that, right? So at that point, we were pretty cooked, and unfortunately, Rogsai was able to turn the corner and win the game pretty quickly after that. So that one's definitely on me. I was beating myself up pretty hard after that round. Basically had the opportunity to win that game pretty succinctly on turn 2 with a pretty clean breach line that happened to get through Ristic Study, but I missed the line on that one. So that was definitely one of the tougher losses of the day for sure. So round 3 was a really interesting one where I was able to get out a really early Necro Dominance. And it was looking like I was able to, put a lot of pressure on the game. This is a round where I don't really remember a lot about the decks that I played against, but I know that player 2 was on Blue Farm. Yeah, once again, I didn't take any notes during this tournament. This is going to be definitely one of the more quick sort of summaries there. But the game inevitably came to a head when multiple times with my Necro Dominance, I was just failing to connect and I was failing to get there. And I had probably one of the worst Necro Dominance Necro rips of my life where I just got like no mana off of it. I didn't get any of my flash enablers. Like I was pretty badly cooked at that point. So I was at 3 for a pretty solid portion of the game. And basically I was like, hey, everybody, like you can not attack me. Okay. There was also a Balin deck in the pod too. I do remember that specifically because they were attacking me a bunch with Balin and Emil. So we got to a point where Blue Farm, who was going second, was gaining a pretty solid amount of advantage. And mistakenly on my turn, I had a bunch of artifact mana that I had been using because I had like gone for a breach line where I wasn't winning at that point. It was just to get more interaction for the table. It was a very complicated, messy board state for sure. And so I had assembled that, and I basically passed to the Blue Farm player's turn. And I was just sort of scrambling to get something at this point after the Necro had gone just so poorly for me, right? Uh, Unfortunately, the Blue Farm player then plays a Grand Abolisher. And I was still feeling great about that because I had Ragavan, I had my Dargo, and I had Silas out, right? So I basically have a 1-mana Otawara in hand. I'm like, oh yeah, Otawara is going to stop the Grand Abolisher. I'll be able to bounce the Grand Abolisher. And there were multiple pieces of interaction between myself and the other players at the pod. The unfortunate part about this, and this is a fun PSA for everybody, Grand Abolisher does not just say you can't cast spells or activate abilities of creatures. It also says artifacts and enchantment abilities can't be activated either. And me being a silly guy, I had only left up artifact mana. So when I went to interact and go to bounce the Grand Abolisher with my Otawara, they were like, you can't use those treasures to bounce this Grand Abolisher. And I looked and I only had an Arcane Signet and a Felwar Stone left over. So, or I had 2 mana rocks left over apart from that. So yeah, we lost. That was another tough one where I was like, oh yeah, right. That is the text on Grand Abolisher. And I definitely should not have messed that up, but I did. And so that one was another tough L, but yeah, that was another a tough lesson learned, but good PSA for folks out there. Don't let Grand Abolisher resolve if you only have artifact mana and you want to bounce it or use a Besage or something like that. Tap your mana differently for sure if you fear there's a Grand Abolisher down the line. So round 4 was myself, followed by Nadu, then Kirik, and then Blue Farm in last. Now, this one had been pretty interesting where I mulliganed to 5, and it was a really bad mulligan to 5. I gambled turn 1. Meanwhile, everyone else kept 7s, to be clear. I gambled turn 1 to find a mana crypt so that turn 2 I could play a 1 ring. And I pitched the mana crypt to the gamble, right? So I was already on a really low mull, basing it on a gamble, got super punished by it. Now, luckily, I did top deck a land the next turn, and so I basically go hellbent because I go Simian Spirit Guide into Cabal Ritual into the 1 ring. That's all I have going on for me. Nadu gets some value down pretty early, but isn't really Shukoing or anything like that. Kirik is definitely having one of the slower Kirik starts. He was pretty responsible. It was like a hand that had like Opposition Agent and Bowmasters and stuff like that. So it was like a very disruptive Kirik hand. It was not a very much like kill you turn 2 Kirik hand. Blue Farm played a little bit of advantage early, kept around an intuition that got fought over. So they were struggling for card advantage for a while in the game because they pushed really hard and then kept getting disrupted too. The ring is killing me this game, and everyone is sort of just chipping away at my life total because I have the ring. Now, obviously, when your opponent has a 1 ring, like you want to be pressuring their life total a good amount. Kirik also just really never got attacked for the whole game, which was also pretty rough. I mean, at one point I had to use a Swan Song to protect them, so they had a 2/2 bird. And people were like, well, I want to connect with somebody. I don't want to just, hit the Kirik. Like basically hit the bird for Kirik because Nadu had a ciphered card or something like that. So basically the entire time I'm drawing a bunch of cards off the 1 ring, but it's just lands and interaction. And I was being very forthright with that with the table. Like, hey, I really don't have any win conditions. I don't have any way to push for the win. My life total is being hemorrhaged by this ring. And once again, after getting blown out by the gamble turn 1. So I'm like, I'm in a really bad spot through the majority of this game. And I'm basically playing Grixis Table Police, which is not exactly what you want to be doing when you're playing a Grixis deck with explosive creature combos in it too, right? So that was pretty tough as we're going through this match. I just keep catching a bunch of incidental chip, and my life total keeps going down and down and down and down. Eventually, we get to a point where Nadu kind of fizzles on an Umbral Mantle because that gets countered. And then we go into Kirik's turn, and Kirik makes a pretty big push at this point. There's a lot of spells cast, and I have the chance to interact with it, right? Now, at this point, Blue Farm has played their own Bowmasters because they use that Bowmasters to kill Kirik's Bowmasters, and they're doing their best to put pressure on Kirik, but Kirik's not drawing a lot of cards. They're just doing the classic Kirik looping stuff. So we get to a point where I'm still being the responsible party of the table, but I keep getting attacked a bunch, right? And my ring's on like 4 or 5, right? And Kirik's about to go off, and I look at the Blue Farm player and I go, hey, I would really like to interact here and stop us from losing the game, right? But I need something here. Like, can I activate my 1 ring without getting shot down on my turn, right? Because I'm at 8 life or something like that point, or I will be at 8 or something after I take my ring damage, right? And it is also important to note that throughout this entire process, Kirik loses a majority of their blockers. And then goes back up to 40 life because they were trying to loop Grey Merchant of Asphodel. But once again, through my disruption, I was able to stop them, actually like turning that into like just a win, right? So Blue Farm agrees to not point the Bowmaster triggers at me during my own turn, so that I can at least draw some cards and like keep interacting and stuff like that, so that I save us in the situation, right? To not basically turn into a king-making thing. That happens, and then Blue Farm untaps on their turn, once again, with the Bowmasters, and they put a Wheel of Fortune on the stack. And I go, well, okay, I literally can't let that resolve because you will use it to kill me. I'm at 8 life, right? So I'm going to show you a miscast, right? Which does counter the wheel. But at this point, Blue Farm has exactly 8 power on board, and they go, okay, I'm just going to kill you. Which was not great. And you know, didn't violate the terms of our agreement, right? Like it was on me that I should have said, also don't attack me on your turn. But Kirik was all the way back up to 40 life, and so I'd kind of expected them to get the attack that turn. And so I didn't get an opportunity to continue during that game, unfortunately. Kirik did eventually go on to win that game because they had a Necro at 40 life. So the Necro, to be fair to the Blue Farm player, was not on the board at the time, and they had just had their win attempt stop. So the boards were very scarce in comparison. But yeah, I did get taken out of that game before I had a chance to really do anything with my 1 ring apart from save the table a couple times. So at this point, I'm 1-3, right? And with the size of the event, I have a feeling that I should be still playing for the win. I'm pretty sure that 2 wins gets a couple people in there, and notably, the person, the Rogside player, Manila, that I had lost to in round 2, is currently the first place spot in the Swiss, right? So I think my breakers are actually pretty good. So if any 10 pointers are going to get there, I have a feeling the people that I've lost to are going to be boosting my breakers really, really hard, right? So because it's a 61 person event, I think at the end of the day, so we're assuming a couple people with 10 points might get into this top 16, right? So I'm like, okay, I'm still playing for being alive in this game, right? So that being said, I go into the last round. Now this round is super fascinating. There is a Derevi player, a Blue Farm player, a Voya player. Voya, the Naya Scourge of Standard, is a really interesting stacks version of that deck. And then myself in 4th seed, I want to say. Yeah, in 4th seed. Okay. So Derevi comes out really early and basically gets down the Nadu and Nomads and Core combo really, really early in the game. And the game really pivots. Blue Farm stumbles on lands a little bit too. And it turns into a game of Archenemy pretty quickly, where we are all just like trying to throw as much interaction as possible at this Nadu, which we aren't able to do in a permanent way, right? It's a lot of like being able to deal with Nadu and Nomads for a limited amount of time. And they luckily, off the Nadu Nomads combo, don't draw like a ridiculous amount of interaction, right? It was like a Cyclonic Rift and like 1 counter spell. So before they're able to get an entire table's rotations worth of Nadu triggers, Blue Farm is at least able to bounce the Nadu back to Derevi's hand, and we're able to kind of be like, okay, this is our sort of one chance to get something done. Now, at this point, I misread my opponents a little bit, and I had thought that the Blue Farm player didn't have any stack interaction, right? So I basically go through this line where I like play some mana rocks, sack a couple creatures, play Dargo, play a burnt offering into something or another, and get out an ad nause, right? So my thought process was I either go right for a Wheel of Fortune to wheel while the Nadu is no longer in Derevi's hands, right? But I'm like, I also can really mess myself up here, right? And once again, I was kind of reading that nobody had any stack interaction because I knew Derevi didn't. But I thought the blue farm also didn't have any stack interaction in hand. Turns out they did, right? So um, we end at this point where I put the Adnaz on the stack, right? And the blue farm player goes, "Hey, can I convince you to use that Adnaz, right? In a way that will not kill us, like or like if I show you counterspell right now, right? Can I let you know, like instead of just untapping the Derevi, like can you go get a non-lethal Adnaz going, basically, right? So I accept the terms, right? Like I'm like, yeah, like this makes sense, right? We're in, if they counter the Adnos right now, which was once again, I've accidentally put ourselves in the situation because I'm like, hey, like I don't think anyone has anything, and then I was wrong, right? So I go, yeah, I absolutely can do a super disruptive Adnos right now. So I draw a bunch and I assemble this breach line where I like have to play and get back Dockside a bunch of different times. And once again, I agree to the deal on the proposition, right? I'm not going to win on my turn. That is 100% not what I'm doing, right? And at this point, I do a bunch of different stuff. I'm like digging through the deck, looping the Dockside, doing a bunch of different stuff. And I get to a point where I do play a Valley Flood Caller, but with not a bunch of mana up, like not enough mana to combo by any means. Another part of this too is that a bunch of my win conditions do get removed during this process, right? So a lot of my combos, I don't even remember what combo I eventually end up using in this game because so many of them actually ended up in exile during this turn because I'm trying to basically storm in a way where I'm not winning the game. It was a weird one. But we get to a point where I hit a wheel, I throw away the hand that Derevi has that has the Nadu in it, and therefore this thing that's like the big boogeyman of the table right now is away. So I pass with the Flood Collar up, and basically I have my entire thought process is like, okay, I have the defense grid in hand, and I have to be able to get something that will get me a Yawgmoth's Will, right? Like that's basically my only way to do anything in this game because my breach is already gone, right? And so are several of my combos. And I'm like, okay, I basically have to get a Yawgmoth's Will combo, and I have to get enough mana and get enough resources so that I'm able to Yawgmoth's Will into Thoracle Tainted Pact, right? And that's it. That's literally all that's left for combos in my deck. So everything else messed up. Also, the thing I mentioned about Dargo earlier in like the deck tech section, where I said Dargo kind of needs to be around for any of these things to work, right? That is super important here because yeah, Dargo had been used during the turn that I was describing earlier, right? So because Dargo had been used, it meant that my Dargo combos were basically offline at this point as well, right? So I'm definitely very much in a tough spot as far as like trying to win this game. Basically Derevi goes their turn, they play a couple value things, they pass. We get to Blue Farm's turn. They have sort of recovered after the wheel. They end up passing, and it gets to Voya's turn. Voya just plays a dork and passes the turn, or maybe they play Voya at this point. I don't remember exactly. But at the end step, we're at this point where I know, well, we can't really afford to draw. We have maybe 15 minutes at most. I think we're actually getting down to like 7 minutes at this point in the game, right? So I'm like, I cannot afford to draw in this game. I have to go for a win, right? Like there's literally nothing else. I have to go for a win this turn. And I don't really have a solid win right now, but I'm like, between my draw for turn, anything like that, I got to go for it, right? So at the end step, I flash in a defense grid. And it was revealed later that my opponents had a lot of interaction in their hands, but none of it that hit that artifact specifically, right? So I flash in this defense grid of Voya's end step. They don't win in their end step. Instead, it goes, untaps, and gets to me. I'm able to get a piece that allows me to go and grab the Yawgmoth's Will. But even then, the Yawgmoth's Will doesn't actually give me the game at this point because things are so messed up and I've exiled so many of my resources. Eventually, I string a number of spells together to grab a Mnemonic Betrayal, right? Which Obviously, post wheel mnemonic betrayal makes it sound like it's really good, right? But you have to remember that two of the decks, one of them is a Bant deck that's a little stacks heavy, a little mid rangey creature combo deck, and one of them is a Voya stacks deck, right? Which is not going to give me anything off mnemonic betrayal, right? So I put a pretty tight line together at one point where I cast a Chrome Mox out of the Derevi's graveyard, which then gets me a Culling the Weak out of Blue Farm's graveyard, which then allows me to string a bunch of spells together to the point where I'm able to, with the combination of everybody's graveyard, throw together a Thassa's Oracle and Tainted Pact to be able to get through my entire library. So that game was absolutely crazy. I lost a ton of my resources to a storm turn where I agreed not to win the game, right? Very crazy stuff there. I kept my word there and absolutely did that. Luckily, the flashing in of the defense grid at the end step before mine was enough to be able to get me to win the game. So crazy, crazy game, 100% wild interactions, basically all around. And it definitely was a well fought game from my opponents as well. So with 2 wins, I do actually make it into the top 16 at 10 points. I believe I was one of 2 10-pointed individuals who made it into the top 16. And then everyone else had 11 or more points. So in sort of a spiritual rematch, I play Sean Manella in pod 1, who is on Rogsai. Then we have Tanner in second seat on Blue Farm. And we have Sam, my opponent from the same round we played Sean in previously, who is on Timna Dargo. So ironically, 3 of the same players from round 2, swapping out Tanner for our 4th opponent from round 2, make up the top 16 pod. And I want to shout out this top 16 pod because I've literally never laughed harder in a top 16 pod. We were all having a great time. We were laughing so hard. There were so many fun things that happened in that game just because it was one of those games where just a bunch of silly stuff kept happening, but the energy was so nice. Everyone was having a great time. It was very, very fun. So anyways, that being said, it was very cool. We had basically, Sean was able to get a very early Time Twister out from Rogsai. I was able to get a Gemstone Caverns down before then. And the turns were sort of passing around where Tanner on Blue Farm had gotten so badly messed up by the Time Twister that it completely threw off his whole strategy. And luckily, it like a big part of this game was that turn 1 because Sean had mulligan down to I want to say 4, right? So his turn 1 Time Twister was basically like I want to say it was land, play Rograk, Infernal Plunge into Time Twister after playing a Lion's Eye Diamond, right? And I was like, honestly, I don't even mind the Infernal Plunge into this, right? But I'm like, because you have the Lion's Eye Diamond, I think we're going to die. So I'm very tempted to mental misstep this, right? And John looks at me and he goes, hey, look, I don't have to crack the Lion's Eye Diamond. I'm at 4. Like, I'm just happy to get this Time Twister through. And I was like, I got a Gemstones out of it, right? Which is like the best thing that you can get if you're going to get turn 1 wheeled is literally a resource that you can have when everyone else gets their stuff reset. And I've already basically I would be down to 5 cards already. Right. So I'm like, okay, yeah, like this is a really good deal for kind of all of us. Right. So Sean stumbles a little bit on his post Time Twister hand. He doesn't like pop off super hard with it, but he gets a decent thing going. But yeah, Tanner gets really punished by the Time Twister. Sam actually gets a really solid hand coming out of that. He is able to just play a bunch of resources the second turn. I'm able to play a little bit of mana, but I'm not able to like pop off super hard. I'm like just starting to set up my mana basically. Sean gets back to his turn. He just replays Rograk and passes. Now, obviously, like we were all like, oh my God, I can't believe he actually did that. But it was to turn on the Fierce Guardianship that he had in hand, right? So Sean passes to Tanner, who's on Blue Farm. Blue Farm says no land drop, pass the turn, right? We then go to Sam, who's our Dargo Timna player, and he tries to jam a Bolus's Citadel. I don't have anything for it, but Sean, our Rogside player, does have that Fierce Guardianship that we just talked about. So the Bolus's Citadel doesn't make it. I once again just play a little bit more mana, and I think one of my commanders, or no, I've set up to the point where I have a Relic of Legends, and I know Next turn, I have this Wishclaw Talisman in hand. I have a couple other resources. I'm like, I know that by turn 3, I can start setting something up to go for it, right? The Time Twister didn't mess me up necessarily. It just slowed me, right? Sean untaps, plays some mana, and then passes his turn. Once again, Tanner on blue farm, still stumbling on resources, holds up mana, passes. Sam goes for a Grand Abolisher, and I don't have anything for the Grand Abolisher. Once again, Dargo Timna, Sam playing this Grand Abolisher. I pass on it. Sean goes, all right, I don't know that I can like stop it per se, but I'm going to at least flash out this Orcish Bowmaster so that it, so that basically like if he goes to draw cards for his win, he will get pinged down, right? Blue farm has to pass on all of that. And then the Grand Abolisher resolves. But because Sam had used a lot of resources on the turn previously to be able to get the Bolsa Citadel out, he was actually able to set up a loop with Dockside and Chthonian Nightmare, but then wasn't able to have an outlet for that combo, right? So he was able to make infinite treasures and has Dargo Timna, but there's no outlet in Dargo Timna. So he would have needed to tutor another thing to be able to actually convert that into a win, right? So by the time it comes back to me, I don't think there's infinite treasures there because I think he stops going for it because I think he doesn't want to feed Dockside a ton, if I'm remembering this part correctly. But at this point, I am able to untap. I'm able to play the Wishclaw, crack the Wishclaw, and go and grab a Mnemonic Betrayal to try and do a Mnemonic Betrayal line because at this point, between all the resources we've spent over the course of this game, I have enough resources to be able to get there. There's some fast mana, stuff like that. The LED, ironically, hadn't been cracked, but there was enough pieces where I was going to be able to go through and do a Mnemonic Betrayal line. We do see Blue Farm fight me by throwing out a Counterspell, but I have one to fight his Counterspell in return. No one else has anything. And I'm able to use that Mnemonic Betrayal to be able to win the game. So went from the second lowest score, or no, the lowest score in the top 16 to being able to move on to our top 4. Our top 4 is pretty funny. I mulligan all the way down to 4. We have Wounded Satellite in first place on Nadu. We have Gage in second on the Minsk and Boo Naya Hulk deck, which is pretty cool. And then we have our third player, Michael, on Thrasios Rograk, and then me in last on my deck. As I said, Multi 4 pretty low on that one. I basically get it to a point where turn 1, I get out a Goblin Engineer. And turn 2, I have out, or is it turn 1 Silas? Yeah, I think I played Silas turn 1. Then turn 2, I played the Goblin Engineer and put the Altar of the Wretched in my graveyard. The Altar of the Wretched is able to then, next turn, if I sacrifice all the right stuff, I'm able to go and get Dargo out and then sack it to draw 7, right? So, for a multi 4, having this ability to do a one-sided draw 7 still sounds pretty good, right? Wounded doesn't really do anything for these first couple turns. Thrasios Rog plays a couple pieces, but doesn't go too crazy. And Minsk and Boo Naya gets their deck, or gets their commanders out pretty early on, right? By the time we get to the third rotation of the table, this is the turn where I will be able to get my altar back out. Wounded taps out for Nadu. He had mentioned he'd mulled to like 5, I think, at this point. So he'd mulled kind of lower, but he hadn't really done anything the first 2 turns. We were like, okay, he's just been sandbagging to get Nadu and then play something else and then probably combo off from there. And then Gage untaps on Minsk and Boo. And I'm like, hey guys, there's a very solid chance that he just plays a Rector here and we die, or, Pattern or something like that. And he untaps and he plays Pattern of Rebirth on his Boo token. For those who don't know, the deck wins at that point because Minsk acts as a sack outlet by targeting creatures on your battlefield and assigning their power and toughness to 0, right? Which makes them automatically die to state-based actions, and you're able to go through an entire sorcery speed Protean Hulk line with your commander. So Pattern of Rebirth is put on the stack. Thrasios Rog kind of looks at the table, passes to me. I pass because I don't have anything. I mulled the 4 on, and then passes to Wounded, who does not have anything because he tapped out for Nadu. And then the Pattern of Rebirth stuff happens. And and it's kind of simple as that. Minsk and Boo just wins the game because we didn't have it. Turns out our Thrasios Rograk player did have a Fierce Guardianship, but he thought by the way that Max had tapped out for Nadu that he was just sandbagging a counterspell. So we died with a counterspell available to stop the game-winning spell, and that's how the finals end. It was a really anticlimactic finals. It was all of us being like, yeah, we don't have it. And then us being like, well, I guess we did have it, but we didn't have it. So GG's, guys. And yeah, that was my top 4 run at SCG Tampa. Definitely a weird tournament. I actually really thought Silas Dargo was pretty powerful. Those second and third rounds, I definitely had those 2 punts. And I said, I think the deck performed better than I performed with the deck. I think my game sort of kicked into gear, obviously, in the second half of the day. And there were definitely points during the day where I felt like I was playing very, very well, but I was still able to do so, which was awesome. So I felt pretty grateful about that. Silas Dargo was a blast to play. I had a really fun time with the deck. I think it's a super fun version. It's a super fun take on the Grixis archetype. I think doing stuff with Silas for the first time is like kind of fun. Dargo opens up a bunch of different unique combos. I still think there's like 3 or 4 different distinct ways you can build this partner pair alone, which I think is really, really cool. I think you can build a version all about sacrificing Dargo. You can build like an ad nauseam version of this deck that's all about like heavy mana values, just things like Ruthless Technomancer and more things like Altar the Wretched, like 3 mana Ob Nixilis that come in and sacrifice things equal to creatures' powers and that just turbo out that type of archetype. I think there's a version of this deck that does like exclusively that. I think there's a version that focuses a lot more on some of those combos that I mentioned earlier in the episode, like things with Phyrexian Altar and Kozilek's Unsealing. There's a version of this deck that messes around with Razaketh lines where you can use things like Luca to get into them. There's a lot of really unique ways to build this deck. I felt really happy with the version that I brought to this tournament. I genuinely felt like it was a really powerful deck, and I felt really like that the deck was performing quite well for me. I like having some of the quirkier lines that are very Dargo specific as opposed to a deck like Rogsize. So I had a lot of fun playing this deck, and I think it's definitely very real. As I mentioned, there were definitely some points where I think the record I should have had left with Swiss on would probably be a little bit better had I not messed up during those 2 games. But I still think the deck performed really, really well and felt super, super solid. So definitely happy to play this list again at some point. It was really a blast. Definitely a fun, weird take on Dargo, and happy to have made top 4 with it. What do y'all think? What do you think was one of the more interesting moments from this discussion? I think I mentioned some pretty unique decks out there. Obviously, seeing things like Derevi or Voya in that last round was pretty cool. Some interesting stuff here at SCG Con Tampa. I really enjoyed playing this deck, as I mentioned. Curious to hear if anyone has any thoughts about some of the includes or even excludes from this deck. Like, I know personally I was not on Demonic Consultation. I was only on Tainted Pact for this list, which I know many people would find to be a bit of a hot take. I was playing one of my favorite cards, Displacement Wave, which I never saw during the tournament, so I can't really comment on that. But yeah, it was a really, really fun time. Curious to hear if people, I'm going to leave this deck in the description below. If anyone has any questions on any of the cards that I played during this tournament, feel free to leave them in the comments. I'll be happy to answer them. But thank you all for watching this video. Appreciate you all, and I'll catch you next time. Peace.
I know I've been quiet for a minute. I've been grinding, still in it. I've been counting these digits. Excuse me. I know I've been quiet for a minute, but I'm back on my business. If you see me, don't trip, just excuse me. Wrong if I do, wrong if I don't. That's why I do me no matter what, so excuse me. Lie if I do, lie if I don't. The proof is in the story, take a seat. Excuse me.